We're picking up in chapter 20, The Changing Life of the People, with pop culture and consumerism. So starting with popular literature, the surge in childhood education in the 18th century led to a remarkable growth in people's ability to read. And so between 1600 and 1800, the percentage of people who were literate went up considerably. And so this promoted growth in reading, both of the Bible and these things called chap books, which had Bible stories and prayers and devotions, and then told about the lives of the saints and other Christians who had remarkable achievements. And so as far as entertainment is concerned, there were often like funny stories or fairy tales, medieval romances, like crime stories. A lot of times those were true. Adventure stories. Some pop literature was highly practical, and it dealt with farming or how to grow plants or how to make your own household repairs. And then there were also almanacs, and almanacs had calendars that listed secular, religious, and astrological events, and mixed that with agricultural schedules and just random facts and even jokes. And we know that even almanacs today try to predict when snow is going to happen the following season. So these were in print even in the 1800s. So although most ordinary people didn't read like the great works of the Enlightenment, many urban working people were exposed to some new ideas through pamphlets or even rumors and gossip that spread through the workshops and taverns. Thomas Paine, who was an everyday Englishman who immigrated to the colonies, authored one of the most popular revolutionary works called Common Sense, and this was written like on the level of an 8 or 12-year-old reading ability. And he ended up selling over 120,000 copies just in the first months of its publication, which is just a testament to working people's ability to receive Enlightenment ideas, many times through literature. So what did people do for fun? So our next topic is leisure and recreation, and this was really a wide-ranging topic. Socializing was an important activity in any European village, and most of the time it took the form of peasant families gathering to talk and sing and doing crafts around the fireplace, women gathering to sew and just to talk, men usually drinking and discussing ideas in the village tavern. Towns and cities, depending on their size, offered a wider range of amusements. Sometimes they had pleasure gardens, theaters, libraries where people could check out books. Other things that they did were like spectator sports, such as horse races and boxing matches, bullfights. As in Rome, blood sports were a popular leisure recreational thing for the masses. So most of the time that was like bull baiting or cockfighting. But popular recreation many times merged with religious celebration in festivals and processions throughout the year. And so they would have carnivals, like a time where they celebrated Lent, which is 40 days of fasting and penitence before Easter. So even religious events became community recreational events that gave people a chance to socialize. And in the second half of the 18th century, educated elites who had previously shared the popular enthusiasm for religious festivals and blood sports and carnivals and drinking in the taverns began to criticize them. And they said that they were superstitious and sinful, and they promoted disorder and vulgarity. So that began to show up around 1750, some people criticizing these types of events. So what did people eat during this time? For the most part, bread and grain. That was basically what the masses ate. And that's why if prices rose above a certain level that consumers thought was fair, they would often take the situation into their own hands by stirring up bread riots and having just an angry old time in the streets. A lot of times, though, the rural poor got their hands on a fair quantity of vegetables, mostly peas and beans. Sometimes they had fruit in the summer, but they were able to eat vegetables. They often had milk, like goat's milk or cow's milk, that was used to make cheese and butter, and sometimes peasants would sell that cheese and butter in the market to earn extra money for taxes or land rents. Unfortunately, most European countries had harsh laws restricting peasants' hunting on land. So such laws were bitterly resented, and it made it difficult for average people to add a lot of meat to their diet. But if they went into the market, of course, bustling markets in towns and cities often had meat and vegetables and fruit. Although bread and grain and peas were pretty much what made up the bulk of the diets of small traders and artisans and most poor people. Of course, this was not true for the upper classes. They were able to enjoy a wide variety of foods. They had an abundance of meat and fish, and their dinners often lasted several hours going into the nighttime. Around the 18th century, many Europeans began to add sugar and tea to their diet, and with the expansion of the colonial slave trade in the New World, new colonial goods came in like coffee and tobacco and chocolate, which enriched the diets of the European poor. A consumer society. The proliferation of goods, both in variety and number, led to greater consumption and wide-ranging new attitudes toward consumer goods. And historians call this the consumer revolution. Basically, people began to consume a ton of goods. The result of the revolution was a new type of society where people derived their self-identity from the goods that they consumed. And so the increased demand for consumer goods was stimulated by merchants who came up with these clever marketing strategies. And they opened fancy boutiques with fun stuff in the window to make people want to go inside. And they began to diversify their product line so more people would be interested in their goods. The clothing consumerism was primarily a female thing. New gender distinctions in dress had come about by the end of the 18th century as men began to renounce bright colors and instead preferred fabrics of plain dark color. There were also new levels of comfort within the home as households began to feature a greater variety of cutlery and dishes, and they had more books and artwork and prints in their home. Often they would have window glass that was more transparent and cleaner stoves. So this was just an age of consumerism, pretty much. People buying and consuming lots and lots of goods. Religious authority and beliefs. We'll start with church hierarchy. What was that like in the 1800s? Well, as we know, back in the Middle Ages, the local parish church was the focal point of religious devotion and often community unity or community cohesion. Parish churches were also subject to control from the state. So Protestant areas regulated territorial churches in the same way that Catholic areas regulated their territorial churches. So they were subject to the authority of the state. Catholic monarchs during this time began to take on more control of religious matters in their country, which actually weakened the power of the Pope. And that was especially true in France and in Spain. The well-educated Jesuits, we've talked about them before, the Society of Jesus, who initially went out as teachers and missionaries during the Inquisition to re-Catholicize people. Many of them began to exercise tremendous political influence, and many of them held high government positions and even educated the nobility in their colleges. So they were able to reach a high position in society. Some Catholic rulers also believed that the clergy in the monasteries and convents should not just be focused on politics and how they could have power over their people, but that they should also have a more practical contribution to society. And so in some places, Catholic leaders permitted only orders that were engaged in teaching and nursing or other practical work, like giving or taking care of the sick. During this time, there was also a Protestant revival, and this has sometimes been called Pietism, and I'll put that up here. But this was really just a call for Christians to experience a warm and emotional religion. And they believed that anyone could experience this from any class of society or any race or ethnicity. So Bible reading and study were enthusiastically extended to all classes, which also provided a boost in popular literacy, as well as individual development. But as this movement spread outward, starting in Germany and spreading outward throughout Europe, its impact extended to John Wesley, who was a catalyst for popular religious revival in England. And so after becoming a teaching fellow at Oxford, Wesley organized a club for his students who became known as the Methodists. And I think this was intended as an insult initially, but they were called Methodists because they were so methodical and committed in their devotion to prayer and to Bible study. And this is the denomination we now know as Methodists. So after Wesley's own mythical emotional conversion in 1738, he was convinced that any person, no matter how poor or uneducated they were, might have a similar heartfelt conversion. And so he took the good news to everyone that he could, traveling about 225,000 miles on horseback, preaching the message of hope and joy and salvation that could be found in Christ. So following Wesley's example, evangelicals in the Church of England triggered an even broader awakening among the lower classes. Religion also flourished in Catholic Europe around 1700. The tremendous popular strength of the religion in Catholic countries was in part explained by the church's integral role in community life and pop culture, particularly through religious festivals. Cornelius Jansen, for instance, was a bishop in Ypres in the Spanish Netherlands, and he called for a return to sincere Christianity, the Christianity of St. Augustine. And this movement was outlawed by papal authorities, but it continued to grow, and it was called Jansenism. And it attracted Catholic followers who just were dying for religious renewal, especially among the French. And there were many members of the France's urban elite, especially in the court system, and some parish priests who became known for their Jansenist piety and spiritual devotion. And I'll spell this down here so you can write it. Jansen. This was the guy's name, and then IST. That's the people who followed him, Jansenists. Marginal beliefs and practices. This really just refers to the superstitions and the old wives' tales that were added to Christianity by the poor people. Most ordinary European people during this time combined a strong religious faith with a number of superstitions that had been around for a long time. And so there were religious authorities who wanted to, quote unquote, purify their religion, but most of the time that was met with anger by these poor people that wanted to hold on to their superstitions. So looking at the medical practices of Europe during this time, let's just say you don't want to have a disease during this time in Europe. So we'll start with faith healing and general practice. Care of the sick in the 1700s was the domain of several competing groups. So you have faith healers, apothecaries, who are kind of like pharmacists, physicians, surgeons, and midwives. And the faith healers usually tried to drive out demons or evil spirits that they believed were lodged in the sick person and were causing the disease. Apothecaries, probably a safer route, usually sold herbs or drugs or medicines for every kind of illness. Because medical training was so expensive and it took so long, physicians usually came from really prosperous families. And they usually concentrated on urban patients that had similar backgrounds that they did. So they had little contact with urban workers and even less with peasants. But like apothecaries, physicians had placed an emphasis on purging, and the practice of bloodletting was still considered a medical cure-all. So that was used for almost any kind of disease. If they couldn't figure out what it was or they didn't have a medicine to fix it, they would just try to let the blood out of a person so that the impurities would come out. So hospitals and surgery. In the 18th century, most surgeons began to study anatomy on some level, so they began to improve the art of surgery. And with endless opportunities to practice surgeries, army surgeons led the way. They were on the battlefields ready to amputate and cauterize wounds whenever needed. So by this point in time, surgeons could amputate and cauterize the stump to prevent or reduce the likelihood of death. Unfortunately, because anesthesia was hard to control and really dangerous, almost all operations were performed without any kind of painkiller. Many patients died from the agony and shock of such operations, and many died of unsanitary conditions because surgeons and physicians were not aware of the possibility that a bacteria from even a simple wound could kill a person. So midwives assisted in the labor and delivery of babies, and many times they also treated female problems like venereal diseases or difficulties breastfeeding or infertility, and a lot of times they worked with children as well. Training for a midwife usually consisted of spending time with another midwife who had been in the practice for a long time, and generally midwives were respected in communities. Unfortunately for them, after the invention of forceps, which became publicized in 1734, surgeons and physicians began to attack midwives as ignorant and dangerous and tried to persuade wealthy women that they were superior in practice. So therefore, if they were going to have a baby or they had some type of problem, that instead of going to a midwife, they should go to a physician or a surgeon. And just to throw a name out at you, Madame du Coudray gave a lot of insight as to what was going on with midwifery. Her book, Manual on the Art of Childbirth, released in 1757, was part of her campaign to teach better birthing techniques to village midwives. And so this gives a good indication about what was going on with midwives, especially in France. Just to put this out there, midwives generally lost no more babies than did male doctors or surgeons or physicians who were treating noble women. So the greatest medical triumph of the 18th century was probably the eradication of smallpox. Just to throw a statistic out at you, about 60 million Europeans died of smallpox in the 18th century, and about 80% of the population experienced it at some point in their lives. So the name here is Edward Jenner. And after 18 years of collecting data and researching smallpox, he finally performed his first vaccination in 1796 on a young boy. And once he published his findings in 1798, this new smallpox vaccination spread rapidly, and smallpox nearly disappeared in Europe.